Well, everyone, aloha mai kakoe mau aloha, and of course, Maui no ka'oi. So glad to see you here today. Welcome to the Grassroot Institute at our monthly event here on the island of Maui. I'm Keli'i Akina. I'm your trustee at large in the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and I thank you for supporting me in that. But my capacity here today is as president and CEO of the Grassroot Institute. We are so proud of our team here on the island of Maui. Would you give a big hand to Joe Kent, who directs our Maui work, right back there? Hey, Joe. Rochelle First over here, give her a hand. Thank you for manning the table so well. And we do want to say thanks to some of our sponsors. Today's event and this series are sponsored by the Ho'omoana Foundation and Peter and Debbie Martin Foundation. Peter's here and Allie is here. Give them a big hand. Why don't you wave to us? Thank you so much. Well, I want to get straight to what we're doing today. This is a double header. The first part of it is going to be pretty brief. I'm going to introduce to you our latest research project, which is going to go to the public in about 1 week on the island of Oahu. And then after that, you're going to hear from Stephen Greenhut, and he is a national expert who knows more about what he's talking about today, which is the high cost of the public sector on the backs of the private sector, and you're going to learn a lot from him. I'm looking forward to that, and we're going to do several things with Stephen here on Maui and then back on the island of Oahu. I remember back when I was an economics major at Northwestern University, my mentor, advisor, was the economics advisor to George McGovern, who was a presidential candidate at that time. I remember the first week I was so impressed with macroeconomics that I went out to lunch with my professor. He paid. He taught me that if I stuck around him, I could have a free lunch. Eventually, I found myself down at the University of Chicago to hear a man who had just won a Nobel Economics Prize, and that was Milton Friedman. He did not buy lunch for me. Instead, I had to buy my own lunch at a little restaurant at the campus of University of Chicago called Tan Staffel. Well, when I walked in there as a young undergraduate, wet behind the ears, I had to ask, what is Tan, T-A-A-N, Staffel? And then the waiter there gave me this long story about how a king saw that his country lacked prosperity and lacked wealth compared to all other nations. So he called all of his wise men in and said, give me the definition of economics. Well, each one tried to explain economics to the king, but failed, and so off with their heads. Until one court jester who didn't want to lose his head, it was dear to him, came up to him and said, the secret of economics is Tan Staffel. And the king puzzled over that and said, what is Tan Staffel? He said, Tan Staffel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Today you're paying for this lunch, by the way. You're paying below cost, by the way, for everything involved here, but it ain't free because we want your friendship. We're upfront about that. Grassroot Institute is a free market public policy think tank doing work that is not being done in the state. We do wonderful things in this state. We have wonderful public works departments. We have public services. We have a great cadre of workers at the city, state, county, and federal level. The problem is not that they are paid. The problem is not that they are paid well. The problem is that the system is set up in such a way that they are paid on the backs of everyone else who's not being paid. Does that make sense? You see, today we want to recognize that we have recently released some original research at the Grassroot Institute. And in about 1 week in Honolulu, we're going to do a news conference and present a report called The Costs of Public Employment in the Aloha State. It's a landmark study, the costs of public employment in the Aloha State, because it shows for the first time in one place exactly what the public is paying for county and state workers here in Hawaii. Today, we're going to give you an exclusive preview of that, so everybody who is here today gets a PDF copy. Now, to make sure you get your PDF copy, either be somebody who has paid online for today's event, or make sure, and we hope everybody does, you fill out one of these cards with your questions and with your comments, and if you make sure that your email address is on this, especially if you're a guest today and didn't register, make sure your email address is on this. We'll send you a PDF copy of this, as long as you promise not to give it to the press in the next week, okay? It's an embargoed copy. Basically, in this report, we show that county workers in the state of Hawaii make amongst the highest pay of county workers nationwide. That's even after you deduct for the cost of living. An average salary is about $75,000 in fire departments and police departments, not including benefits. That's the high end. Some public workers don't make a lot of money at all. Our report also shows that state workers make fairly low amount of money compared to others. Here on the island of Maui, specifically, where we've been doing some of the research, we find that police workers make $74,100 plus benefits, and firefighters approximately $85,000 on average plus benefits, compared to state workers or county workers who make $46,000 if we don't take into consideration the overtime, and the private sector workers, which on average for comparable work make $35,000. Now you might be wondering, well, what's the big deal? So what if you make good money in government? That's not a problem in and of itself, and we have some fine government workers who are working very hard and very well for the public. The problem is not how much is being paid. The problem is the mechanism by which payment is being made. In other words, the costs are being borne by the general taxpayers. And the issue is such a situation sustainable? Is it sustainable? Can we keep going on? There are several factors we look at that suggest they're not sustainable. The first is the nature of our unfunded liabilities for pension and health care for public sector workers. Right now it's at $23 billion, and although we have a plan for paying it down, we don't have a plan for getting out of the situation where it goes deeper and deeper. Another thing that makes it unsustainable is a very important dynamic that we released 6 months ago, and that is that the Hawaii government sector, in terms of cost, is growing at a faster rate than the private sector. Now, when you study economies across the world, that is a red light. You want your private sector to be growing faster than your government sector, because when your government sector is growing faster than your private sector, you can't sustain the economy. And if you'd like to see our report on that, just make a note on your little card here, and Joe Kent will send that to you. Finally, we're in an unsustainable situation because of a battle that is taking place right now. Our office on Oahu is 2 blocks away from the state capitol. We're there every day, and one of the biggest battles brewing is over the renegotiation of wage packages and benefit packages for our unions. And this is a very difficult situation because in many cases, union workers deserve some kind of raise. Take, for example, teachers. We want to pay our teachers better. We don't want them to be at the low end of national salaries. We wish that they could be at the high end. But the problem is we just don't have the money. So how do you solve this problem? At the Grassroots Institute, we believe that the solution is not in the details. The solution is in understanding what a free market-based economy is. Right now, the doctrine in our state says that if we want to do something, raise taxes on taxpayers. As we've shown you, that's unsustainable. But there are other models that we've looked at. One model is Singapore, where the government makes money so that officials who make 6-figure salaries are actually bringing in far more to the government, turn government into a business. We're not saying that we can do that in Hawaii, but we've looked at multiple models, including Sandy Springs in Georgia, where we sent our research director, Joe Kent, and we're a center for disseminating what's going on there. And Sandy Springs has privatized 95% of all government services and is making a profit and returning money to the people. The point is this. When we look for best practices across the world and across the country, they exist, but Hawaii is not practicing best practices. Instead, we have a system that's not sustainable. I'm hoping that some of you will run for county office, for state office, for federal office, and get in. And when you get in, I hope you'll start the dialogue that will change things. Until then, we're proud here at the Grassroots Institute to do your research that is of value. So do make sure we have your contact information, and we'll get you a preview of this report. Now, Stephen Greenhut. How many of you are already fans of Stephen Greenhut, and you came to hear him today? Let's hear it by your applause. I set you up there, Stephen. Let's hear the applause of the rest of you who don't know Stephen Greenhut. All right. Stephen Greenhut is author of a book called Plunder, How Public Employee Unions Are Raiding Treasuries, Controlling Our Lives, and Bankrupting the Nation. Based upon that title, I took Stephen aside and said, here in Hawaii, we love our public workers. Say whatever you have to say truthfully, but nicely. It's kind of the way Joe Kent wrote an article recently. Joe wrote about the the teachers' union's call for higher pay. And the article was brilliant. It's on our grassroots website. It's how to raise salaries for teachers without taxing the public. Now, if that intrigues you, that gives a good thing for everybody. Stephen Greenhut knows that there's a solution better than what we have across the country. He's a columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune. He was formerly the VP of journalism at the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. He founded a group in California called Cal Watchdog, and he writes regularly for publications including Reason, R Street, Bloomberg, and City Journal. We're glad that we're able to say at the Grassroots Institute, Stephen is a friend and a scholar who contributes to our work. Please give Stephen Greenhut a big hand.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Let me get this out of your way here. Sure thing. We're glad you're here today. Okay. Let me just say one more thing to Pete. I do want you to have plenty of questions and comments for Stephen. He's going to talk for about half an hour, and then after that, he's all yours. Sound good? Let's give another hand to Stephen Greenhut.
Oh, yeah, that sounds good. I'll get that arranged. Yes, and yes, I love public employees. It's not personal. My dad was a teacher. It's just a question of balance and affordability and fairness. So anyway, I often when I give a talk, I'll talk about use the reference to those Scared Straight programs. Have you ever heard of those where you take at-risk youth, which is one of my favorite terms, and you take them to a jail and you scare them straight so that they don't have a life of crime? So I always say that in California, which I usually write about, and I work for the R Street Institute and write an Orange County Register column, is everybody in California ought to watch the legislature in action, and that will scare them straight to vote correctly, or at least think more about the vote that they have. But what I'm here to do today is to give you a little bit scared straight about what California is doing with pensions and public employee pay scales. Hawaii is not there yet, but at the rate you're going, you need a little bit of a wake-up call. So that's kind of the discussions Joe and I had about the talk. So, actually Hawaii is doing a pretty good job keeping up with California, given your small size. We have almost 40 million people. You have, what, 1.4 million? And your pension fund is underfunded. It's 54.7% funded, which is dangerously low funded. It's probably one of the lowest funded pension systems in the country. That's the percentage of money you have to pay for all the pension promises the government officials, have made. So California's atrocious 68% on the CalPERS system, our biggest system, the California Public Employee Retirement System. Okay, taxpayers in Hawaii are having to pay up to backfill the shortfall, because of course all these public employee pensions are ultimately on the back of taxpayers. I think I read in the article it's going to be at least another $385 million. So yeah, you're a pretty good job. You're on the way to being like California. Your pension hole is, what, $23 billion? Which, now, your pikers compared to Californians, I think our pension hole has been estimated at somewhere between $160 billion to $1 trillion, depending on the rate of return used. But then again, you guys only have 1.4 million people. I'm a journalist, not a math whiz, so figure it out. But I think per capita, I think you guys are in bigger trouble than we are. And also, here's another thing. Hawaii's has jumped 50% in a year. Now, that's impressive, even by California standards. And, of course, I'm being a little bit facetious, but now your employer contribution rates haven't reached California levels. In some places in California, we're paying more than 50% of the salary of the employee in their benefits, and that doesn't always consider the unfunded liability, and that's the amount of debt that isn't accounted for. That's the whole. That's the difference between what's funded and what isn't. So anyway, now that's money that could be, as local governments increase the contribution rates and backfill the fees to the public employee system. That's money that could be used for better services. That's money that could be used in all sorts of ways. I know you guys are like we are. We won't even mention returning anything to taxpayers. So, but it could be used, at least spent better. Okay, so look, your local governments will soon be as strapped as ours. And what's wonderful is your retirement board officials refuse to accept responsibility. I read a quote. I think I'll read it to you later in the paper. But that's really that's the California way. And Now, before I forget, grassroots study that, it shows that the county workers, are among the highest in the nation. You've even topped California's. And those numbers, I know in California's numbers, when I look at public employee numbers, they typically don't include overtime and benefits and all sorts of things. So you're number one on that issue, and we're number three. But your private sector workers are at the bottom, which is another area, really a problem area. And it's just exacerbating this economic divide that I'm seeing. And the point of my subtly titled book, Plunder, was that we're seeing a massive wealth transfer from the private sector, the people who actually earn the money, to the public sector. And when you had mentioned the no such thing as a free lunch, which is one of my favorite sayings, there is something known as a complimentary lunch. So the problem is our folks in the public sector, we need the public sector, but everything it spends, even those portions that we need, are paid for at the expense of someone else, and it's not by choice, it's by force. Anyway, Plunder, I wrote Plunder in 2009, and things haven't gotten any better since then. In California, I mean, they've largely gotten worse, and I see from Hawaii seems to have gotten worse, even though I haven't been tracking it since 2009. But we're not just seeing, a shift in finances, we're seeing a shift in power. We're seeing, more bureaucracy. In some ways, I mean, it's maybe an overstatement, but in some ways it looks like the public servants are our masters, right? We can't reform anything is one of my frustrations because of union power. We just can't fix anything. So we can't fix school systems. We can't fix police forces. It's hard to get more accountability. And, they're supposed to work for us, government employees, even the best of them. They're supposed to work for us. So one of the things you've probably all heard about the Oroville Dam. I happen to have invested most of my investment portfolio in rental houses right underneath the dam, which lovely historic town, so I'm really, really smart there. But I was speaking at a conference in Berkeley last week, and people were talking about, the dam problem is caused by global warming. I'm like, it may or may not, climate change may or may not have something to do with water levels, but the problem at Oroville Dam is that we haven't maintained this massive dam. It's just a total government failure effort. And I live in a low-lying rural area that's dependent on levees that have been sitting there since, the late 1800s, right? So, yeah. Anyway, those... it's Hawaii. We're going to go surfing or whatever. But anyway, Oroville Dam is a problem of infrastructure neglect. That's what it's a problem. And part of the reason for infrastructure neglect is it's not a direct pension issue, but we're spending money on other things. And the things we're spending money on in California, one of the things has been public employees and pensions and salaries. So we see all sorts of. There's never any money to fix any of these things, but there's always money to give increases to public employees, and their salaries aren't subject to market rates, not directly. We always hear the story from people that public employee union people, you want the best people, but when they open up Qualcomm Stadium, a true story, and get 22,000 people applying for one firefighter opening in San Diego, that might suggest that the market is a little bit out of balance, right? So you want good firefighters, but at $184,000 average pay and benefit package for 3 days of work every 2 weeks, paid for sleeping, maybe it's a little bit out of balance. And 95% of their calls aren't even for fire; it's for paramedics, which all used to be done in the private sector until the unions forced them out of business, used their political muscle. So I would say, and those are real numbers. In fact, I had a firefighter union boss complain to my editor when I was at the Orange County Register because I wrote in a column that they're paid for sleeping, and he demanded a correction because they're paid while sleeping, which I was I usually don't love corrections, but I was more than happy to do that one. So There was one city manager in I think it was Roseville, a suburb of Sacramento, who was quoted in the newspaper saying that cities have become pension providers that offer a few public services on the side. And he should know, I think his salary was unbelievable, and so was his pension. But the fact is that's true. In some of the cities like Stockton, which went bankrupt, you could get a lifetime medical care, what one council member called a Lamborghini-style medical system. You get that for you and your family members for life after working for the city for 2 months. Now, anyone if I did that for one of my employees, we'd be out of business in how many weeks, right? But anyway, the $100,000 pension club, and we have a database in California of that, and we're better on transparency than Hawaii, where we get the names of the people and what they work, what they earn. $100,000 pension club's going up about 40% a year. And when you start looking, a lot of those pensions aren't just $100,000; they're $200,000. And I mean, these are millionaires' pensions, right? Because how much money would you have to have in the bank to earn $200,000 to $300,000 a year, guaranteed for life, for you and your spouse? You would need $8 to $10 million. I don't know, some actuary here could figure that out, but you would need millions of dollars. So these are millionaires' pensions that we're giving. And there's a real actuarial term I heard from an actuary called the Viagra effect. So a lot of folks are retiring. They're retiring so early, like police officers in California retire with full benefits at age 50, and they're marrying on second marriages, marrying 30-somethings, and then the taxpayer has to pay until that 30-something goes to the great, police station in the sky. So the actuaries have to figure that out, and that's millions upon millions of dollars. And we're wondering why we're actually laying off police officers, and cities are crumbling around us. Stockton, which went bankrupt, try to get any public services there at all. So in California, we passed something called, the legislature passed SB 400 in 1999. It's a bill that retroactively increased pensions for California Highway Patrol. So retroactively, a guy's about to retire tomorrow, and he gets a 50% pension increase going back to the day he started 30 years ago. Seems like a gift of public funds to me. It did also to another legislator who filed a suit, but that didn't. Nothing happened. But anyway, that started just a domino effect of pension increasing across the state, and we're still paying for that right now. 15 years later, virtually every police agency in California has the 3% at 50 formula. That's 3% times the number of years work. So if I start at 20, at age 50, I get 90% of my final year's pay. It used to be the final year, which meant people did all sorts of ridiculous spiking gimmicks. But now it's the final 3 years. So that's 90% of your final year's pay, and these are often $100,000 to $200,000 jobs. If you get into police chiefs and assistant chiefs and the assistant to the chief, there's quite a lot of bureaucracy in police departments anymore. And that's before the disability pensions that are so flagrant. Chief's disease, the Sacramento Bee came up with the term. I have never found, I've offered to buy lunch for anyone who could introduce me to a California police chief or a chief-level employee at CHB who has not retired with a disability, and I've not had to pay that lunch. We had one in Irvine who dropped a briefcase on his toe, irritable bowel syndrome, you name it. So that protects 50% of the pay from taxation. So they're not even paying their load on taxation. There was just a story in the LA Times about a police official. It was either LAPD or LA County Sheriff. He had one pension from one department, went on to get another pension from another, and then went on to take another job. And it was, $500,000 a year, courtesy of taxpayers. And the idea of a generous pension is so that someone doesn't have to retire in penury. Doesn't mean that you get to live like a CEO at age 50, sitting at the beach somewhere. So that's the kind of situation we've got here, and in California, not here. And you potentially could get there if you don't do some of those sorts of things that need to be done. So I mentioned the firefighter salary. Oh, my favorite, I did a story for about UC Berkeley for the American Spectator a couple weeks ago. They have an inequality department, I forget the name of it, it's some PC nonsense. But it's about the whole thing, all the research is about promoting income equality. And if you read on their website and the research they've done, and they like to print this leftist French economist about the evils of it. Anyway, the guy running the department makes a pay and benefit package of $412,000 a year, and all the folks on the advisory board earn somewhere between $375 and $525 in their University of California positions. Anyway, I think that kind of speaks for itself. I mean, it pays well to be concerned about income inequality, but the real inequality is coming from the divide between the public sector and the private sector. That's what I'm seeing. You're seeing it here in Hawaii. It may not be as extreme as California, but it's certainly true in California. And I also find a lot of the public employee union people and advocates, they're amazingly mean about it. Like, you guys just have pension envy, ha, ha, ha. And they brag about their pensions. And so it doesn't seem like there's certainly not a we're in it together situation when you look at the pensions or the non-pensions that your average private worker has. In Orange County, we have lifeguards earning more than $200,000 a year. Now I'm sorry, that's occasionally a difficult job, but there are people that line up to do what really seems like a cushy job to most people. So we have massive unfunded liabilities. The numbers are so large, it's hard to even know what they mean. The California Policy Center, a very fine think tank in Southern California, they found that despite the myth that public employees earn less than private employees, but get a little better in benefits. It's nonsense. They earn overall about double what your average private sector employee gets, and that number goes higher when you include those unfunded pension liabilities, twice as much. Now, I'm sorry, that's not the way our nation was designed, and no offense meant to public employees, many of whom do an important job. But it's turned on its head. It's not supposed to be that way. So every dime spent by a public employee is money that was earned from someone else. So anyway, oh yeah, and what we're seeing worsening services. Services aren't getting any better. And in California, we started something, and here's something to keep an eye on. It might come, and anything stupid in California could spread elsewhere. But we have something called the Secure Choice Program. The state's creating its own mini Social Security program that private employers have to contribute, and it pays some measly amount. I mean, it's just crumbs to the mere private sector workers, and it's based. The returns are based on the Treasury bond, and it's in the works. It hasn't started yet, but it's all been approved. So, I mean, from the same folks who've bollocksed up our whole public sector system, they're going to create one for the private sector. Some people suspect it's just a way for CalPERS to get its hands on private workers' dollars. But the thing that's so weird, I had reported on it when it was then Treasurer Bill Lockyer. He was complaining about those of us, I had mentioned the term pension envy. This is back in around 2009, 2010. There was actually a burgeoning pension reform movement driven to a large degree by some progressive Democrats who realized what pension problems like were doing to their cities, like Chuck Reed, liberal Democrat, former mayor of San Jose, and pension costs increased 350% in 10 years in that city, and that obviously was cutting into their ability to provide other services. So they were starting a pension reform movement, and then Bill Lockyer gave a speech to some public employee group and talked about how, we've got to do, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, we have to do something about pension envy, that pensions are a political problem for us. And when he said us, he meant us as fellow public employees. So they came up with this system to throw a bone to the private workers, and it's just going to be another boondoggle. So anyway, I mentioned there's some other unseen costs here, and some of these are not purely financial. I just wrote a piece for the Orange County Register about a Santa Ana pot raid, where some police went in to raid a medical marijuana dispensary and then were caught on video eating snacks, destroying the video cameras and making fun of the disabled person who worked there. And it was really gross. It's online. They didn't realize that the dispensary suspected that there was going to be a raid and had a hidden camera. And anyway, it turns out that so there's a settlement that's costing the city, I forget, I think maybe $1 million or $100,000, I guess in this case. But it turns out one of the police officers involved in that had been involved in other disputes that led to other settlements. And I saw a story about some guy who, some police officer, I forget which department, who had 90 complaints filed against him, and he was just promoted. And I'm seeing this, that my theory on the policing problem is the unions make it impossible to get rid of the bad actors. So the bad actors stay and they infect the departments. And a lot of those bad actors commit the same sort of problem. I mean, if you have a person who's abusive, they're going to tend to be abusive over and over again, and it ends up costing city taxpayers a lot of money. It also, is harmful to the community and causes needless pain and suffering. The LA Times had done an excellent series on public schools in LA Unified School District, which is a massive bureaucratic mess, as you can imagine. Imagine if the Soviet Union ran anything. I think that's kind of what it gets compared to. It's just this massive, unchangeable bureaucracy to the point where a lot of the Democrats in that city have been trying to change it, and it's just an impossible system. And I was on the Stossel show, and the New York School District's the same thing, and he said, we were laughing. He was talking about how you get rid of a teacher in the New York Public School District, and he had this chart. And it was just this little, like a Rube Goldberg, you all remember Rube Goldberg-like thing that went here and there and there, and the peels here, on, and everybody was laughing when he got to the end of the sheet, and then he let drop 4 other sheets. So in other words, you can't fire anyone. So we have rubber rooms where teachers are being paid, and they're just sitting there doing nothing, collecting their pay while the unions adjudicate their firing. So if you can't fire people, you're not going to be able to get rid of bad actors. That's very costly. So, so there are a lot of costs. A part of the problem in California is we have something called the California rule. Some other states, I don't think Hawaii have this rule, but it keeps us from fixing anything. In other words, I worked at a newspaper once, and we had an actual defined benefit pension. It was very small. I think I got $300 a month from it. But when we got a new buyer, they said, you no longer have a pension starting tomorrow. We make good through the end of today, but starting tomorrow you have a reduced, or in that case, a reduced to zero rate. Oh, well, that's fine. It's moving forward. Nothing's taken away from me. If I don't like the deal, I can get a deal somewhere else. And as you can imagine, in the newspaper business, I didn't take another deal. In the public sector, that's not allowed. The California rule, which isn't really a rule, but it's a series of court decisions, they interpret it that once a legislature, a city council, board of supervisors, the state legislature promises a pension benefit, it doesn't matter, come hell or high water, it can never be reduced unless something equal is given in exchange. So we can't even reform things moving forward, and that's the problem we have. We can't reduce it on a forward-going basis. We can reduce it for new hires, but that might help in about 30 years when those new hires start retiring. In the meantime, we're getting these massive increases in unfunded pension liabilities. So that's a big problem we have here. And then it is kind of interesting that the pension funds, at least ours, which love to blast evil Wall Street, are hoping that Wall Street is going to bail them out for their constant increases. Anyway, so the same kind of stuff spreads everywhere. You see it in California, Illinois, New Jersey. We're getting shades of it here in Hawaii. So let me give you a few, a few little warning signs, things to look for when you start listening to the folks who are advocating for an expanded public employee pension and pay system. Okay, what they do a lot is they use averages. I get this all the time. Well, yes, we admit that there are these guys making $1 bazillion a year, and that's an abuse of the system, but the average pensioner, government pensioner, gets about, I think it's like $32,000 to $34,000 a year. And that is true, and that includes everybody going back to the Pleistocene era, everybody who's worked for 5 hours. It's an average, right? So everything's averaged together going back many years, and people who are part-time workers. That average, by the way, is still 3 to 4 times what your average private sector employee gets. So if we want to deal with averages, but the formulas are the formulas. If you get a 3% at 50, and you're earning $100,000 a year, you will, at age 50, averages aside, you will retire with $90,000 a year, plus all the pension spiking gimmicks, disabilities, and all of that. So that's just something that needs to be debunked, because when they throw out that number, it doesn't sound like a big deal. One of my favorite ones, the police and fire. And by the way, we can't let police and fire off the hook. I spoke to a conservative group, and somebody stood up and said, well, I think we should, I don't understand why you're talking about police and fire. We should let them off the hook. I said, well, why don't we just go home and not deal with the issue, given that they're 75% of the problem? If you don't want to deal with it, you do whatever you want. But I believe it needs to be dealt with. And they have the biggest abuses and the biggest pensions. One of the fictions that they tell, and they tell it often, is that the reason the pensions are so large for police and fire is that they die I've heard different things, usually 3 to 5, 5 to 7 years after retirement. So they only have a short life of public service, so they need a massive pension in their few years left. Well, I went to the California Public Employee Retirement System, and I got the research, and they do great research. They're a horrible organization, I'm sorry, but they do really good research, and they provided me with their survey that they did debunking it. Essentially, the longest living public employee of any type is a police officer, followed closely behind by a firefighter. They tend to live to be in the mid-80s. So it's just not true, right? So whether you think they deserve that for other reasons is something you can discuss. I don't think they do, but this we die early nonsense, we should always deal in honesty and not listen to their nonsense. Okay, they'll say that another thing to look out for is sometimes public employee bargaining units will give back, they'll increase their pension contributions because they're so concerned about, they're so public spirited, they're trying to help. And then in return, they will, on another day usually, they will get raises that compensate for it. And then those raises, though, then it's a ballooning effect because you've just increased their pensionable pay. So look out for that. Another thing that gets said a lot is, and this is to look out for if you're on a local government watchdog, well, our pay and benefit packages are below 50%. We're below the average. Well, yeah, somebody always has to be below average, right? It's Garrison Keillor. But so what happens is one person one agency will increase, and then somebody falls below average, and then they increase. So then we go up and we create a one-way ratchet. Okay, the claims that a 50% funding level is okay, it's not. It's a big problem. Claims that going from 2 to 3% is a 1% hike. No, it's a 50% hike in pensions when you figure out the formula. And the other things, and I will get. I think we should get to questions in a few, or just give me a minute to wrap up. They'll say that we get a 7% rate of return forever. Well, one legislator I know said that's like banking on the Angels winning the World Series every year for the next 30 years. Could happen. And look out for the many ways that they spike their pensions. If you're a manager, you get special management pay, things that ought to be included to begin with. So these are some of the things to look out for. Oh, and disabilities. The disabilities, we'll hear people say, hey, we have so many disabled workers. Well, that's because the system is rigged so that it's almost always the disability is granted. And it's not an insurance benefit in the public sector. It is it's approved by other public employee folks. So anyway, I've got, let's take some questions. I've got some solutions we can discuss. And all sorts of specific questions, whatever you want to ask, I'm here. Yeah.
Let's have a big hand for Stephen Greenhut. Thank you very much, Stephen. Good job. Now, he's all yours. Any questions or any comments? Yes, sir. Go ahead. Here.
Oh, yeah. I want to be a public employee when I grow up. In California.
overdue for declaring bankruptcy. What happens when a city or a state goes bankrupt?
Okay, well, with oh, sure.
Just for everyone, what happens when a city or state goes bankrupt?
Well, states can't go bankrupt, but they can become insolvent. I don't think we're anywhere near that in California. I mean, I was on a show where the host, it was one of those Fox Business shows. When is California going to go bankrupt? Well, I don't think it's going to go bankrupt. It just has a lot of really long-standing financial problems that are going to drag out and destroy public services. Cities do go bankrupt. Stockton's a city I know quite well. What happens is, the whole bankruptcy court, they were in federal court, and they're allowed to cut back their pensions, but they chose not to. So the result is, as I reported, I broke this in a story for the Union Tribune. I got a copy of the confidential memo the city had, and it looks like they've come out of bankruptcy, and it looks like they'll be in trouble and possibly go back into bankruptcy in a few years. Same thing with Vallejo, also that's in the Bay Area. So it means if they don't deal with the pension problem in bankruptcy, it'll be a continuing sea of financial problems. But they are the bank. Judge Klein said that they are allowed to get rid of cut back their pensions in bankruptcy. So that's the one thing that might help. Is city unions might say, hey, if our city gets bad enough, we might lose everything.
Just a quick follow-up on that. We were doing research and testimony on the Maui Hospital transition to the private sector in terms of labor last year. And one of the pieces of information that came up is that California's Orange County had actually privatized all of its public hospitals. And I was wondering if that was part of their coming back from their own bankruptcy, Stephen.
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I know a lot of the hospitals are so heavily funded by public subsidies that I don't know how much a difference. It's like with universities. I mean, a lot of the private universities, they're private, but the issues are driven by public funding. So I don't really know, but that's a good thing for me to look at.
Thank you. And for those of you who know about our Maui hospitals here, that was part of the package of information we gave the state legislature to use as presenting a model for privatization. Next question or comment from anybody? Yes, sir. So do bondholders take the loss first?
Yes, that's what happened in Stockton. They fought. They had they challenged the decision, the bankruptcy decision, but they ended up getting, some of them got like 5 cents on the dollar or something like that. But it isn't seemingly affecting the bond markets. People are still investing in these cities. But the public employees did not take any sort of bath at all in Stockton. It was easier to just impose it on the bondholders, yeah.
I think you have a question. Oh. Someone else have a question over here? I thought I saw, right there, I saw your hand. Go ahead.
Well, I would like to listen to some of your solutions. I think you brought them out great points. Love to hear about your solutions. And then before that, I'd like to know a question. How much of our unfunded liability due to management?
Okay, good question. How much of our unfunded liabilities, I assume you mean in the state of Hawaii, is due to the mismanagement of the EUTF? Was that your question? Yes. And then your second question is, could you suggest some solutions?
I don't know on the Hawaii situation, but usually, I mean, it's mismanagement. It's usually not a big part of the problem. The problem usually is, I mean, it's not. I don't know the specifics of the mismanagement. In CalPERS, in California, the management is, it seems they've had a number of scandals and problems, which certainly doesn't help and ends up squandering money. And of course, a lot of the investment decisions they make are political decisions, like divestment from coal, divestment from tobacco. So you're having a largely political agency. It's a government agency make investment decisions. So they point to good years they have, but the problem is the system. The problem is the defined benefit system. We're promising people a great deal of benefits that just aren't sustainable. And then the legislature, like when I mentioned SB 400, goes back and massively increases the amount then there's more money that has to fund the system, and then what you see happening is the pension funds will get ever more aggressive. And that's what caused one of the reasons that caused the Orange County bankruptcy. It was really weird investment scheme. But the fact is, then the investment end's important. But the main problem is the unsustainable level of benefits that they're provided, and then the legislators often are increasing those benefits. And then we have in CalPERS, we have more recipients than we have people paying into it now. And one of the public employee folks said to me, well, that shouldn't matter because it's a sustainable system. I'm like, it shouldn't matter if it were a sustainable system, but it's not. That's what unfunded pension liabilities are. That's the amount that's not sustainable. Now, as far as solutions, a lot of folks, Grassroots Institute could probably sit down and in an afternoon come up with a number of things that will fix it. The problem is all political. So we need to we need to trim benefits going forward. We could move to, even Jerry Brown, our governor, had proposed a hybrid plan between a defined benefit and a defined contribution. I think moving to a defined contribution system where you know what the costs are in advance is good. There are also, we could ban these spiking deals. We can, change the formulas. There are all sorts of things and that could put us on a sustainable course. But the problem is politically, in our state, and yours too, is the unions wield so much political power that we can't even get the most modest reforms. The only reform we got done is called PEPRA. It was a very modest, it was useful, but it was a modest trimming of some benefits and a leveling of some pension spiking gimmicks. That was done, I think, 2012, or went into place in 2013. Only reason it was done, though, was the Democratic legislature wanted a tax increase, an income and property tax, an income tax increase and sales tax increase. And they were using, and the pension reform movement was really energized at that point. And they were using that as a way to say, look, we're serious about reform, you can trust us with more money. But the problem is a political problem, and that's what it gets to.
In fact, if you're interested in following up on that, Joe is back there. Wave again, Joe. Joe's done a paper for us on defined contribution system, and in response to the question, is it management that's the problem with EUTF? While there are management problems, while there are portfolio investment problems, while actuarials tell us they've done it wrong in terms of their estimates and so forth, and while the legislature has allowed rating of the fund over the years, those aren't the deepest problems. Stephen is right. It really is the system itself. Let me let you ask this question, and then over there.
Do you have any copies by any chance of your book for sale?
I will. What I was hoping to do was, I'll give you my email. It's Stephen with a V, greenhut@gmail.com. Email me, and I'll send you a copy, and when you receive it, you can send me a check for $10. How about that?
To make that easy, the white card on your table can be used. Just write, I want Stephen's book, and we'll let him know your email address and so forth. Thank you very much. And also make sure that you fill that out if you want our recent research report on the subject. Peter. Peter, I'm going to let you use the microphone.
But I don't tell you what I didn't even know you were going to bring this gentleman over here. I did read his book quite a while ago, and I think that's what triggered. Joe actually grabbed it, and all my papers, which I couldn't find for about a year, but I guess he did read it, right, Joe? Yeah. But my point is, it is education. I think that is what Grassroots does. And I think one thing, you can complain about something and you can try to figure out what to do, and I think it's education. Maybe there's something else to do. But I think these folks here are making a difference in a lot of oddball ways, whether it's a hospital or bringing light to this.
That was Peter Martin, uncompensated endorser. Any other questions? Yes.
Some of your insights into what reform actually occurred in Wisconsin with Governor Walker and his fight to try and turn that state around.
some insights into the reforms that took place under Walker in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I actually went out there and met with some of his aides who were involved in it. I mean, he certainly succeeded, and it was a political success. Now, they kept police out of the reform, which they did that by choice for political reasons. So they got a great deal. It's been a while since I reported on that. We had a bureau. I worked for the Franklin Center at the time, and we had a news bureau in Madison. So they took on the unions. I think that's the key thing, is they took on the unions head on, and a lot of local agencies have talked about how much education agencies, how much savings they've had, and how good it's been for them. So I think it's helpful, to tell the good news story. But they had to go after the unions. I remember they were blockading themselves, and the Democratic legislature went down to Wisconsin I forget. It's been a while. I was well versed in it, but it's been a few years. But that was an overall success. But they never did follow up with the police. And now their police weren't as overpaid. I mean, relatively speaking, as far as the being as big of a problem as it is in California. But they did deal with firefighters, as I recall.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Joe in the back. Go ahead. Is this a partisan issue? And how do you make the solutions to this issue appealing to unions?
Well, it shouldn't be a partisan issue, right? Because a lot of the biggest education reform voices in California are Democrats in Los Angeles, right? And moderate Republicans like Richard Riordan. Some of the biggest leaders of the pension reform movement in California were Democrats. I mentioned Chuck Reed from San Jose, David Crane, who was Arnold Schwarzenegger's pension advisor. There have been a lot of Democrats who've gotten it. But in California, the problem is that the unions have a real control of the Democratic Party. So we've seen this with a number of reform issues. Republicans tend to be pretty good on it, but on that SB 400, they were almost entirely on board the massive pension increases because of the police and fire, the law and order side to it. So it should be. I've seen some success in individuals. Joe Nation, a former Democratic assemblyman, is a big leader of the pension reform movement. Marcia Fritz, she's another prominent Democrat in the state. So there really, a lot of Democrats get it. They see that it's causing the public services they care about to be obliterated. But the unions do have such a control over the Democratic Party, especially in California, that it's hard to break that grip. And a lot of them will tell you off the record, "Oh, I see, we got to do something about the pensions." But you'll never hear me say it on the record. Well, there you go. And there was a local, in fact, one of the first people to call me to congratulate me on the book was a Orange County union official, and he actually supported a union reform in the county that I forget the details of it, but it was a financial reform that was helpful. It didn't go anywhere nearly far enough. But when they feel that maybe their basic benefits are threatened, they might be able to support some sorts of reforms. Yeah.
In fact, here in Hawaii, if our state Senate wanted to sponsor some reforms, we can guarantee you there'd be no Republican to oppose that. Okay, any other questions? Good guy, isn't he, here? He's going to be around to talk with you personally, and so will our team. Going once, going twice. Anybody else before we leave? Yes, one more question then. Go ahead. We'll make two. What's the relationship between Grassroots Institute of Hawaii and the Tax Foundation? Well, there are two tax foundations that we work closely with. We work with the national organization, and we cooperate with their research on Hawaii issues. But there's a separate organization, which is local, run by Tom Yamachika. I would say we are very good friends. We often research the same subjects. We provide counsel to the legislature on the same issues. And in general, we're trying together to find solutions for Hawaii's public sector that don't result in raising of taxes. Then we have one last question over here. Go ahead, sir, on this table here. No more? Okay, good. Charlie, did you have a question? Well, everybody, I want to thank you. On behalf of the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii here on Maui, we hope that you'll participate in future events such as this. We want to make sure we've got your contact information and your questions on those cards. So if you'll fill them out and drop them off at the table over here with Rochelle, we'll appreciate that. Thanks to everybody here today, and we'll see you next month when we're back again at another event. Aloha.